And here this morning. Beautiful. Beautiful. Resurrection Sunday. Well, I got news for you, just in case you didn't know. Every Sunday is Resurrection Sunday. After Jesus rose from the dead, he never went back into the tomb. So from that moment on, he is alive. Every Sunday in our church is Resurrection Sunday. And that's why we kind of sing the type of songs we do. We kind of dance a little bit, some better than others. You know who you are. And that's kind of why we're happy. It's kind of why we smile. It's because every Sunday is Resurrection Sunday. Jesus is alive. Even Good Friday doesn't become a somber, gloomy day. It's like we put Jesus back in the tomb every year. It's like, no, he never went back. He never went back. On Good Friday, there's still a sense of joy and of celebration for what was accomplished for us on the cross. And we looked at that a few days ago in our Good Friday service, which was incredible. And we want to continue the story. We will look at the resurrection story here today. And in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all are eyewitness accounts of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. You'll see it. You'll see all through there the resurrection of Jesus. And this is the central theme of Christianity, is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And each of those books will give you an account and fill in different details, bring a slightly different emphasis on different aspects of what happened on that day. And the version we're going to look at this morning is Matthew's version of the resurrection. And we're actually going to look at Matthew chapter 28, which is the last chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to go through the whole chapter. And don't worry, it's not the longest chapter in the Bible, so you're not going to be here all day. But we're going to go through the whole of chapter 28 of Matthew, and we're going to break it down into 3 sections. And the way this is going to work is I'll read a section, talk about it, read the next section, talk about it, read the third section, talk about it, and then we are done. But I really believe that God is going to encourage us and speak to us as we do this morning. So let's have a look at this first section of Matthew chapter 28. I'm reading from the NIV, the New International Version. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. Can you just picture that? It's awesome. Greetings. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." This first little section, kind of put a little subtitle of my own under it. This section tells us that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is spectacular. This is a very spectacular scene. This is not ordinary. Never before has a person gone into the grave, announced that they were going to come out 3 days later, and then pulled it off. No one's ever done that before. And no one's ever done that since. And guess what? Chances are no one else ever will do it, because you just don't do that kind of stuff. It is a spectacular moment in human history when Jesus went into that tomb and walked out of that tomb. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is spectacular. You know, Jesus said that he would that he would die and that he would be raised from the dead after 3 days. Jesus had already told the people that. He'd already said that. And you know what? The authorities were actually so petrified that the disciples would concoct some sort of plan, some sort of scheme to steal the body of Jesus after he was dead, to kind of perpetuate a myth that Jesus would have risen from the dead, that they actually went to every measure they could to prevent that from happening. And so the authorities, because they were worried that the disciples were going to steal the body, they ordered that an extra large stone be placed across the tomb. You see, in the old days, just like in our day, you have different sized coffins, right? In those days, you could have an extra large stone placed in front of the tomb. And so one of the eyewitness accounts actually says that it was an extra large stone, meaning that it wasn't the normal size stone you could order. They got the extra big one. They just wanted to make sure that the disciples, because this was the type of stone that needed 20 men to roll it, not 4 or 5. And so they got the extra large stone and put it in front of the tomb so that the disciples couldn't roll the stone away, steal the body of Jesus, and then start telling everyone that Jesus had risen from the dead. Then what they did was they gave orders that the tomb be guarded. And they said, he said that he would rise after 3 days. So for 3 days, we're going to station not just any guards, but the top Roman SAS soldiers. They placed them to guard the tomb. True story. It wasn't just your security guard down outside Macca's, right? This was the SAS soldiers of the Roman Empire. And I don't know if you know much about them, but they were pretty mean dudes. And they lived by a code of conduct. And historical documents tell us what their code of conduct was and the punishment that would come upon them if they stepped out of line. Now, they wouldn't just get a warning. If they stepped out of line, it was execution. If they did anything wrong, if they so much as leant up against a wall to rest while they were on duty, the punishment was execution. If they abandoned their post for any reason, the penalty was execution. If they ran away and fled, most certainly execution. If they allowed the Roman seal to be broken that they were protecting, it would be punishable by death. And so these guys were mean guys. They had a pretty good job to do, and they would make sure that they would do it because they knew the consequences if they got it wrong. And so on the tomb, the third protection they took to make sure that the disciples couldn't go in and steal the body was they put the Roman seal over the tomb. And they draped this big thing along, and they put the Roman wax seal over it so that anyone would know if the tomb had been tampered with. You couldn't get into the tomb without breaking the seal. And so these guys' job was to protect the seal from being broken. And so you can imagine on that Sunday morning when the women come down to the tomb, an angel has come, there's an earthquake, the angel has rolled the stone away, broken the seal, and these amazing soldiers, big tough guys, are all lying on the ground, curled up in the fetal position, sucking their thumbs because something serious has happened. The resurrection of Jesus Christ was spectacular. And so we've got this situation there. Now Jesus appears to the women and says, all right, tell the guys, I'm going to meet them in Galilee. And so that's what happens. So something spectacular happened at the tomb that morning. He was dead, but now the stone has been rolled away. The tomb is empty, and Jesus has physically appeared to the women and said, tell the guys, I'm going to Galilee. I'll meet everybody there. That's the first section. The resurrection of Jesus is spectacular. Let's have a look at the second section. Let's read on through Matthew chapter 28. Verse 11, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Okay, these are the SAS soldier guys, right? When the chief priest had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and get you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. This second section of the story tells us something else very clear about the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus is controversial. From that very first moment, the resurrection of Jesus was controversial. Even this day, the resurrection of Jesus is controversial. It is spectacular and it is controversial. The reason it's so controversial is because if the resurrection is true, then Jesus truly is the King, and we are all accountable to him. He truly is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and therefore he is the ultimate authority, and we all must stand account before him. You can see why that's controversial, because that's not very popular. A lot of people don't really like the idea of the thought that they are accountable to Jesus. And so they will do anything to kind of dodge and weave the truth of the report of the resurrection of Jesus. Because if the resurrection is true, then Jesus is who he claimed to be. And we must all bow down and worship him. So naturally, there's going to be a pushback against that. So even from that very first day, the chief priests who were responsible for the crucifixion, if they thought, man, this guy's risen from the dead, this is going to look really bad for us. So what they did, they got the soldiers and they worked out a plan together. There was a bit of money passed under the table in a brown paper bag, and they said, just tell everyone this is what happened. We'll make sure that you don't get the punishment for letting him go. We'll make sure that you don't get executed because of what happened with the tomb. Just tell everyone that his disciples stole the body. So it's evident from even then on that first day that nobody ever denied that the tomb of Jesus was empty on that Sunday morning. If you ever hear, they've discovered a tomb in Israel and they think it's Jesus' tomb and there's bones in it. It's like, no, that's never been up for debate. Ever since it first happened, everyone knows that the tomb was empty. The real question that people have been trying to figure out is, how did it get empty? Why was it empty? No serious academic questions whether the tomb was empty or not, because that was settled on that first day. And that's why the rumors went out that the disciples had stolen the body. There's only three things that could have happened. Firstly, was that the disciples stole the body, which was actually the story we see here that was actually concocted through a bribe to protect each other. But let's have a look at that. Let's think for a moment, did the disciples steal the body of Jesus? Well, go back a couple of days when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus. One of them was a bit gung-ho, pulled his sword out and chopped off the ear and Jesus said, no, don't do that. We're not going to do that. But only one of them was willing to fight. Only one of the 12 disciples was willing to take on the soldiers. Everyone else ran away. And then even the one who did dare to fight, he went away, and 3 times before the rooster crowed the next morning, he had denied Jesus, that he even knew him. So you've got 11 disciples who are completely afraid of even being associated with Jesus or being caught up in this whole thing. They ran away when the soldiers came. Do you think they're going to front up the next day and take on these SAS guys? It's very unlikely. They were from a place of fear and of cowardice. And all the other stories afterwards, you realize that the disciples didn't even really believe it themselves that Jesus had risen from the dead. Thomas, he's like, even when Jesus is like there, he's like, I've got to put my fingers in his hands and his side just to convince myself that this is real. So the disciples weren't that convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead themselves, even when it happened, let alone that they would go and steal his body, because then they would have known for sure. What about the authorities? They could have stolen the body. So the first thing is the disciples stole the body. The other one is that the authorities stole the body. Well, the authorities, there's reasons. Some people say, well, the authorities stole the body. The Roman soldiers, they just pretended that they were defending it. They actually took the body out. But the only reason you would do that is that if the disciples ever claimed that Jesus had risen, is that you could then say, well, actually, no, he hasn't, because here's his body. We've seen it. Here it is, wheeled out for them. The fact is, the disciples did go out and claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and no one ever came forward and said, well, no, he didn't, because we've got the body, or we've seen the body. No one ever. It was never disputed. No, the body of Jesus was never produced by anybody, who their only motivation for taking it was that they could produce it. So you can see it just doesn't add up that the authorities would have gone to all that trouble to steal the body and then not done anything with it when it served their interest to do so. So that if the disciples didn't steal the body, if the authorities didn't steal the body, what happened to the body? There's only one other option, and that is that Jesus actually did rise from the dead and walk out of that tomb. It is the most likely explanation. When the first English explorers came to Australia, what was it, 1778, whatever it was? Remember that from school or something? First English explorers, they came across an animal that defied all known animal logic that existed to that day. It was called a platypus. The platypus is among nature's most unlikely animals. The animal is best described as a mix and match of more familiar species. The duck, because of its bill and webbed feet, the beaver, because of its tail, and the otter, because of its body and fur. When these first English explorers went back to London to report everything that they'd discovered, everything that they'd found, they took their notes, their descriptions, their stories, and their drawings of the platypus. But guess what? No one believed them. Although there were a number of reliable eyewitness reports of guys who stepped forward and said, look, I saw it with my own eyes. This thing's real. They were completely shut down and branded as trying to concoct a hoax. And nobody would believe them. Because no such animal with all of those characteristics could possibly exist. When they went back to Australia, when the next lot of boats went back, explorers went back again, this time they brought back an actual platypus. Now the poor little thing, it didn't make the trip back home, it was dead on arrival. They took this platypus back and they presented it to the highest scientists in the London universities who had said that this was a hoax and said, well, here's the platypus. Guess what happened then? They still didn't believe it and they accused the explorers of rigging an elaborate hoax. They said, somebody has made this thing. This isn't real. Because this is a true story. You can Google it. This is an actual true story. Even with it in their hands, they still couldn't believe that this thing was real. And these were among the smartest people in all of Europe. Why didn't they believe it? Because it didn't fit into what they already understood of the world. They didn't believe because it didn't fit within their perspective of how the world was. Which brings us back to the empty tomb. Many people just dismiss the possibility that Jesus actually rose from the dead because it doesn't fit into the way they know the world to be. And many of them are just as clever as those English scientists. They say, of course, Jesus didn't rise from the dead because it's scientifically impossible for someone to come back to life after 3 days in a tomb. But you know what? It's also scientifically proven that a virgin can't give birth to a baby. A man can't walk on water. You can't turn water into wine. You can't feed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 small fish. You can't heal a blind man by spitting in the dirt and rubbing the mud into his eyes. But there's a reason we call him God. It's because God does the impossible. That's why we call him God. You couldn't call him God if he didn't do things that were impossible. He'd just be something else. So even the whole notion of God means that stuff happens that is impossible. God spoke and the universe was created. But let's go back to the platypus for a minute. On the first expedition, there was a number of eyewitnesses who all said, we saw it. We can describe it to you. We can tell you everything you need to know about it. We've seen it with our own eyes. But what about the empty tomb on that first Easter Sunday? What about those eyewitnesses? Did they have a story to tell? Well, we're reading one of them right now. Matthew was there. He's written what he saw. Mark, Luke, and John, all eyewitness accounts. But this is what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 to 8. He says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter's real name, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500. Did you get that? More than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, although some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as one abnormally born. So Paul is Paul's writing this and saying, look guys, if any of you are struggling to believe, because 50 years or so has passed by the time he's writing this, he says, if any of you are struggling to believe, because it just messes with your head that Jesus rise from the dead. People are always going to grapple with that. Paul is there. He says, you know what? All these people saw Jesus. The disciples, Peter. He said he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters all at the same time. All at the same time. And he says, you know what? Many of them are still alive. Do you know what he's saying? If you don't believe me, go and ask them. They'll tell you. Many of them are still alive. Go and ask them. They all saw Jesus at the same time. 500 people. Or some people say, oh, they all had a mass hallucination. It's like, do you know what? All they are doing is replacing one miracle with another. Because what's the difference? It takes more faith to believe that 500 people all saw a hallucination at the same time than it does that Jesus actually turned up to them. It's just getting ridiculous by the time you start pulling arguments like that out. But leave the 500 there. He also says in verse 7, then he appeared to James. Oh, I love this. This is such a powerful, just one thought in the Bible. Who was James? James was Jesus' brother. Grew up in the same house. Obviously, half-brother, step-brother. What is it? I don't know, whatever he was. Because of the Immaculate Conception and all that sort of stuff. So Jesus, the older brother. James then gets born to Mary and Joseph. They grow up. There's like 7 or 8 kids in the family. James is the brother of Jesus. All his life, he has watched Jesus be perfect. And do you know what? James hated Jesus. He was jealous. He was envious. You could imagine it. If your brother's like so good, there's all this like, get away from me. And so James was not one of the disciples. James was as far away as you. James was the rebellious brother. He didn't want a bar of Jesus until it says that. I just got all emotional. I just had a thought of how much Jesus loved James. That he went and sought him out. Forget the 500. Appeared to them at once. But he went and sought out his brother James. Loving him so much. Like, James, it's real. I've risen from the dead. It's like the heart of Jesus for James. And do you know what? That changed everything for James. Because when you read through the gospel, the Acts, the book of Acts, you will see that James actually becomes one of the strongest disciples. He is actually called one of the apostles. In fact, James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Him and Peter were the leaders of the church. So you go from this guy who didn't want a bar of Jesus to all of a sudden he's the number one guy in the whole church, the most passionate, the most for Jesus. What's happened? He saw with his own eyes that Jesus had risen from the dead, and it completely changed his life. What would it take to convince you that your brother was God? What would it take to convince you that your brother, who you know, was God? Well, I tell you, this is what happened to James. That's the only explanation for how his life could be completely transformed, that he goes on to be the leader of the church. You see, James's problem was that he had a stone in front of his heart. He had a hard heart towards Jesus because of just by virtue of the fact of growing up in that sort of scenario. No one can blame him for that. It's a pretty big deal to have Jesus as your brother. But he ended up with a hard heart towards Jesus. He had a stone across his heart. There's a great song by an awesome band, Mumford & Sons. I don't know if you know them. They got a song called Roll Away Your Stone, which is where I've got the name of this message from. They got a song called Roll Away Your Stone. It's got this line in it that says, roll away your stone and I'll roll away mine. And together we'll see what we can find. It's like using this imagery of the stone in front of a tomb being rolled away, see what's inside. And in that point, it's like we've all got a stone in front of our heart that we don't actually want people to see in. There's stuff in there that we'd rather people not know, right? There's stuff in there that we're ashamed of. There's stuff in there that's just our hurt, that's our fears, that's our uncertainties, that's our discouragement, our pain. And so we roll a stone in front of it just so nobody can see. James had that stone in front of his heart. But when he saw Jesus had risen from the dead and he saw him with his own eyes, he rolled away the stone. And that is the choice that everyone has to make. Is when you see the risen Jesus, when you're faced with the evidence of the risen Jesus, do you roll away your stone or do you leave it there because you'd rather not deal with whatever's inside? Good news is that when Jesus went into that tomb, carried in there, dead, After 3 days, he rose again, and that stone was rolled away. No one has ever gone into death and left the back door exit open. Jesus has done that. And in Jesus, we also have a way out of death because he's left that door open. And in Jesus, that stone is rolled away. We go into, every single one of us will die. See, Jesus isn't just for life. Jesus is for eternity. And Jesus is alive. And he is in heaven, seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And he said, anyone is in me, hey, you're with me. You will never die. You will have life eternally, is the promise of Jesus. Because we go into the grave and we go straight back out through where that stone has rolled away. But what we need to do that is actually roll away the stone of our life that we have that's keeping Jesus out. For whatever the reason is, you've got the stone in front of your heart that's keeping Jesus out. Maybe it's because there's things that you're ashamed of. Maybe it's because of the pain. Maybe it's hurt. Maybe you've kind of gone there before and it didn't work out. Maybe whatever it is, it's things you just don't want. You don't even think God, you're ashamed of God even seeing it. I'm telling you, roll away the stone. And the grave, instead of a place of death, becomes a place of life. On that first Easter Sunday morning, that grave was not a place of death. That grave was a place of life. And Jesus walked out of there. And that's what he will do to your heart. So James had the stone across his heart. C.S. Lewis was another guy who had a stone across his heart. He was an atheist, and one of his best mates, and he was a really smart guy in one of the universities in London and an academic. And one of his mates was also this incredibly smart guy. And his mate came in and sat in his room one night. He said, I don't know what to do. He said, I'm looking into the evidence of the resurrection, and I'm starting to see that the evidence is that it could actually be true. He said, I really don't want to look at that anymore. Because his mate was one of the biggest atheists in the whole thing. It's like a Richard Dawkins type of guy. And so, you know what C.S. Lewis did? He said his mate never again looked at it and died an atheist. But he had fear of what he was going to find if he rolled away that stone and looked at the evidence, looked at it all. C.S. Lewis said, it rattled him too. He said, I'm going to look at the evidence. And after looking at all the evidence, he came to the conclusion that it was true. This is what he said, C.S. Lewis. He said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. If it's true, it affects everything. And this is why it's so controversial. This is why there's such a wrestle. This is why there's such a fight over the hearts of people. It's because the stakes are so high. The ramifications, if this is true, what it means. That's why Jesus said, I wish you were hot or cold, not lukewarm. How can you be lukewarm as a Christian? It's either is or it isn't. Because if it is, everything changes. It means everything. Simon Greenleaf was one of the founders of Harvard Law School. Have we got any fans of the Netflix series Suits here? Anyone ever watched that? You'll know that Harvard Law School is like the most eminent law school in the USA. And this series called Suits is centered around this law firm that will only hire people from Harvard because they want to have the best reputation amongst all the law firms. They'll only hire people from Harvard. Well, the reason Harvard became the best is because of a guy called Simon Greenleaf. His position was the Royal Professor of Law at Harvard University, and then became the Dane Professor of Law at Harvard, succeeding Justice Joseph Story. Those two men are what make Harvard Law, okay? They set it up. They gave it the prestigious name. That's why the best lawyers come out of this, because of these guys. If you go into a legal library, I don't know if anyone's ever seen a legal library, it's just like books everywhere. It's the biggest library you'll ever see is a legal library. Among the finest works and the most respected works is a 3-volume series written by Simon Greenleaf. It's called this, A Treatise on the Law of Evidence. Law courts in the USA and influenced around the world have been based on what he wrote in that 3-volume series. It's basically on how a judge looks at evidence, teaches judges how to look at the evidence and find a verdict. So he wrote this 3-volume work. It's one of the most, still to this day, over 100 years after it was written, one of the most highly respected, and everything's based on it. He then decided to apply those principles to the resurrection of Jesus. Someone put him up to it. Say, okay, look at the resurrection of Jesus, and based on all the evidence, put it through the rigors of what you would do if this was an actual court case. He wrote a book, and the book was called, he published all his findings into a book. It was called An Examination of the Testimony of the Four Evangelists, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, by the rules of evidence administered in the courts of justice. His conclusion: according to the laws of legal evidence used in the courts of law, there is more evidence for the historical fact that Jesus rose from the dead than there is for just about any other event in history. Do you know who this guy is? See, and do you know one of his quotes? I've got one of his quotes there. In examining the evidence of the Christian religion, it is essential to the discovery of truth that we bring to the investigation a mind freed as far as possible from existing prejudice and open to conviction. See, the reason people don't believe is because they've already made up their mind they don't want to. But if you bring an open mind, and that's what you find, that one of the most amazing things is the most highly respected scientists, lawyers, doctors, the people who kind of are evidence-based in their professions, when they do look at it, what they come around to. And they become some of the most notable Christians of all. You saw in the Alpha promotion, the guy who's director of the Human Genome Project. Like, it's a serious guy. And he said, I'd already decided there was no God, but I never even looked at the evidence, and I'm supposed to be a scientist. You've got to look at the evidence. Just look at the evidence, have an open mind. And what you will find, but that's the problem, is because people don't want to find out the truth. So, but one of the biggest attacks on Christianity is this thought that, well, you can't be a smart person and actually believe that stuff. It's actually the opposite. One of his other quotes, which I should have put up as well, is he says, to deny the resurrection of Jesus is to ignore all the evidence. The truth is actually the opposite to this spirit of the world that says, oh, you can't be smart and believe in fairy tales. So hang on, look at the evidence. Just look at the evidence. So the resurrection is controversial. So what we need to do is look at the evidence for ourselves and make an informed decision. And I encourage anybody to go and do that themselves. Let's close with the final section, and the musicians can come. Final section of Matthew 28. In verse 16, it goes on. It says, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. So firstly, the resurrection of Jesus is spectacular. Secondly, the resurrection of Jesus is controversial. Thirdly, the resurrection of Jesus is life-changing. The disciples, all of a sudden, were given purpose and mission for their life. It changed the way that they lived their life. They were fishermen, they were farmers, they were tax collectors, they were... All of a sudden now they're living for something completely different. The resurrection of Jesus is life-changing. As C.S. Lewis says, it changes everything. Makes a difference to everything. And so it is with us. When you accept the resurrection to be true and you receive Jesus as who he claimed to be, then we too receive this same commission. Every follower of Jesus is called to be a disciple maker. Right where you are, added to your vocation, is a God mission. You might be a plumber, a poet, or a police officer. Jesus calls you to make disciples. If you're a teacher, a tradie, or a technician, you are called to be a disciple maker. You might be a secretary, a surgeon, or a scientist. In all that you do, you are making disciples along the way. Every single one of us here, if you're a follower of Jesus, no matter what your vocation, no matter what your trade, God has placed you there for a reason. He's given you gifts to perform that role and to be a blessing to people and to serve our community. But along the way, he's also called you to be making disciples, to be sharing the love of Jesus, to be serving people with the love of Jesus, not to be bashing them overhead with a Bible, but to love them and to serve them and to point them gently in the right direction. We're all called to help others to roll away their stones. That's what a disciple maker does. I just want to take a minute right now to do the same thing for anybody here who is aware of the stone that they have in front of their heart. Doesn't matter why it's there, doesn't matter how big it is, doesn't matter how well it's guarded. Today, it can be rolled away. If you will roll away the stone that is in front of your heart, just like the resurrection of Jesus, when you roll away the stone, it will be spectacular. Jesus promised you, he said, I have come to give life and life in abundance. Jesus came to bring life and blessing. Incredible life, the most incredible life you could ever have. It will be spectacular what Jesus does in your life. I can also guarantee you this, it will be controversial. Just like the resurrection of Jesus. You roll away the tomb of your heart, it will be controversial. There will be people that don't like it. There will be friends, close family members. All sorts of deals will go on because there's a natural pushback against all that. But if you will get through that, I promise you, rolling away your stone will be life-changing. It will be a life you've never known before. You will not recognize your life. Not immediately. God works bit by bit. But all the things in your heart that you're ashamed of, all the things that were dark, God will do his work on them. And he will bring light and life and mercy and forgiveness and grace and restoration and redemption. Jesus will do that. And your heart will become a place of life. Life overflowing into your family, overflowing into your home, overflowing into our society, overflowing into this church. That's what Jesus will do. If you will just roll away your stone. Can we close our eyes where we are, bow our heads here this morning? If you're here this morning and you know that there's a stone that's been placed in front of your heart, and this morning you're wanting to say, you know what, okay, I get it. I need to roll away the stone. You know, I can sense that Jesus is standing outside and he's calling, he's knocking on the door saying, will you open the door up? I want to come in. Will you roll away the stone? I want to bring my life and my presence and my power, my love, hope into your life. If that's you, what I'm going to do in just a minute is I want you to acknowledge that before God, and I'm not going to identify you publicly, but in your seat where you are with your eyes closed and your head bowed, in just a moment I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Acknowledge that before God. I'll see your hand. I'll acknowledge it. Thank you. I'll acknowledge it. You can put it straight back down. Thank you. People already started to do it. That's brilliant. Awesome. Thank you. On the side, on the back, in the middle, and the front. Once I've seen your hand and acknowledged it, you can put it back down. Like I said, it's not about identifying you publicly. It's just about you owning it before God. Who else is there this morning? If that's you, just put your hand up where you are. To roll away the time. Let Jesus really come in. Let him bring his life. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful. Beautiful. We want to roll away that stone and say, Jesus, come in. Be my Lord. Be my Savior. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you again. Thank you. Who else is there? I'm just going to wait another 10, 15 seconds. I'll tell you, now's the time to act. Thank you. What we're going to do right now is I'm just going to lead everybody in a prayer, and I know even those who you follow in Jesus, you love him with all your heart. I want us all to pray this prayer this morning. So we're going to recommit our life. We're going to just make sure that the stone's wide, that tomb is like open. Jesus is in there. If you lifted your hand then, there's something else that you can do at some point, and there's a number there. You can text, just text follow Jesus to that. What we want to do is just send back, one of our team will send back some links to some resources just to help you get started, take the first step, some things you can read, some options for you moving forward, because sometimes you do this and you're like, what next? Well, it's a good next step. It's just to text that number. We'll help you get pointed in the right direction. That number's going to be up for a while. Even after the service is over, it's going to go back up. So don't feel the pressure right now to have to act on it. Can we just all pray this prayer with me right now? Repeat after me with one voice. Heavenly Father, thank you for your love. Thank you for Jesus dying on that cross in my place. I receive Jesus as my Lord, as my Savior. I roll away the stone. Jesus, come in. Fill me with your life, with your peace, with your healing. Fill me with your Spirit. Help me to follow you all the days of my life. Amen. Amen. Beautiful. Beautiful. Come on, let's give the Lord a big hand here this morning.